Some stories don't ease their way into your heart. They break the door down, sit you in the truth, and refuse to let you look away. And tonight's story is one of those moments. The kind that reminds us that danger doesn't always come with warnings, shadows, or dark alleyways. Sometimes it walks into a park on a sunny Sunday afternoon, slips quietly onto a bench, and waits for the wrong person to pass by. And that is exactly how the life of 7-year-old Emily Grace Jones, a fearless, bright, joyful child, was stolen in a burst of violence so shocking that even the first responders struggled to speak about it afterward. Before her story became a headline, before her name became a rallying cry for reform, Emily was just a little girl who loved running fast, drawing vivid worlds, laughing loudly, and spending weekends with her father. And on March 22, 2020, she woke up excited because she was going to celebrate Mother's Day in Queen's Park, the same park where she had climbed rocks, raced along pathways, and fed ducks countless times. That morning, she handmade a card for her mother, careful, proud, full of love, and as she hopped onto her scooter alongside her dad, the world around her seemed simple and safe, the way childhood is supposed to feel. But what no one knew was that just a few meters ahead sat a woman whose mind had fractured long before that day. A woman whose untreated paranoia had spiraled into something deadly. A woman holding a pack of craft knives she had bought with an unthinkable intention. And as Emily scooted forward, calling out to her mother, who was jogging nearby with headphones on, no one, not her dad, not the bystanders, not the children playing in the distance, had any reason to suspect that danger was rising from a bench behind her, stepping into her path with fatal precision. To understand the weight of what happened that afternoon, you have to understand who Emily was, because tragedies like this do not just erase a life. They erase the future the child was racing toward. Emily Grace Jones was the kind of little girl who made the world feel lighter simply by stepping into it. A child who radiated this bright, unstoppable energy that made teachers smile, friends gravitate toward her, and her parents proud beyond words. And even after they separated, Mark and Sarah built a co-parenting partnership rooted in respect and love, ensuring Emily's life remained stable, joyful, and overflowing with support. She thrived in school, the kind of student who finished her assignments early and skipped up to the teacher with a grin, as if learning wasn't work but an adventure. She loved nature, loved swimming and hiking, loved horses so much that she talked about them the way some kids talk about superheroes. And she approached every new challenge with the confidence of someone who felt safe, grounded, and unconditionally loved. Mark adored spending weekends with her, and that Sunday morning was no different. The sun was warm, the park was busy, and Emily, little fearless Emily, zoomed ahead on her scooter, calling back to her dad as he encouraged her to go faster, both of them laughing, both of them unaware that life was quietly shifting into a trajectory no parent should ever face. When Emily spotted her mother jogging in the distance, something inside her lit up, this pure excitement that only a 7-year-old can feel, and she turned to her dad and said, "Daddy, I want to go to Mom." Words so innocent, so normal, so full of love that no one in the world could have predicted they would be the last joyful words she'd speak before stepping into danger. And as she pushed off on her scooter, racing towards Sarah, who couldn't hear her through her headphones, the moment felt like any other weekend exchange. A transition between parents, simple, familiar, safe. Until Mark noticed something shift in the corner of his eye. A woman rising from a bench in slow, deliberate motion, her hood pulled low, her posture rigid, her energy unsettling in a way he couldn't yet explain. And before the human mind could process danger, fate struck with terrifying speed. What happened next unfolded so quickly that even those who witnessed it struggled to understand it in real time. Because one moment Emily was gliding toward her mother with all the carefree momentum of childhood, and the next moment a stranger, silent, hooded, expressionless, stepped directly into her path with a purpose no one could have anticipated. Mark at first assumed the woman was simply reacting to Emily approaching too closely, maybe trying to help steady her, maybe offering a hand. But within seconds, that assumption shattered as screams rippled through the air, sharp and panicked. The kind of screams that freeze a parent's blood before their mind can even form the words, "Something is wrong." Emily collapsed, not from a fall, not from a stumble, but from an act so sudden and violent that even Mark couldn't process it, his brain desperately trying to match the image in front of him with any explanation that made sense. But nothing about what he saw belonged in a peaceful park, on a sunny day, surrounded by families and laughter. And as he ran toward his daughter, heart pounding, he saw the hooded woman walking away with unnerving calm, as if the world around her wasn't collapsing, as if she hadn't just destroyed a family in the space of a breath. When Mark reached Emily, he realized the truth no parent should ever have to understand. She had been stabbed in the neck, her small hands grasping for air, her eyes wide with shock, her body trembling as she fought to breathe, and Mark, desperate, pleading, aching, held her and begged her to stay with him. Begging in that broken voice only a parent facing the unthinkable can produce. A passing nurse, hearing the screams, rushed over and immediately began trying to save Emily, working with urgency and compassion, fighting against an injury so severe it robbed a little girl of the strength she needed to keep going. And just a few yards away, Sarah, Emily's mother, was still jogging, unaware that her daughter's life had just been stolen in the span of seconds she hadn't heard, hadn't seen, couldn't have prevented. Meanwhile, as chaos erupted near the playground, another parent, Tony Canty, who had been in the park with his wife and child, saw the attacker moving away and, without hesitation, chased after her, not knowing whether she was armed, unstable, or willing to attack again, running purely on instinct and the unwavering belief that someone had to stop her before she disappeared into the crowds. His wife, recognizing the severity of the wound, tore a muslin cloth from their baby's supplies and handed it to Mark in a desperate effort to slow the bleeding. A moment that captured the terrible duality of humanity, monstrous cruelty from one person and extraordinary courage from others. As the park dissolved into panic and disbelief, Tony sprinted after the hooded woman with a courage most people never discover within themselves, closing the distance between them even as he had no idea whether she still held the weapon or whether she intended to harm someone else. He wasn't thinking about danger. He wasn't thinking about risk. He wasn't even thinking about himself. He was thinking about the child he had just watched fall. A child he didn't know, but felt compelled to protect in the only way still possible, by making sure the attacker could not escape. When he finally tackled her to the ground, what he found wasn't resistance, but something far stranger, a detached, rambling stream of words, a woman muttering about injections, conspiracies, and imaginary threats, her voice disconnected from reality, her mind trapped in a world no one else could access. And Tony, breathless and shaken, told her gently, "You're not well. The police will help you," unaware that those words would later echo through courtrooms and psychiatric evaluations. Back near the bench, paramedics arrived at the scene, their faces tightening as they assessed Emily's wounds. This was not an injury a child survives easily, and they moved with precision and urgency, performing CPR, administering adrenaline, fighting every second for a little girl whose life was slipping away despite their best efforts. Mark held Emily as long as he could until they carried her to the air ambulance, his voice breaking as he whispered for her to stay, to hold on, to keep fighting. But even in his pleas, he felt her slipping further, a reality no parent should ever feel in their arms. As the helicopter lifted off towards Salford Royal Hospital, Sarah finally arrived at the scene. Called by Mark with words no mother should ever receive, words so unbearable that her legs nearly gave way beneath her as the truth shattered her world in an instant. And while she rushed to the hospital with desperate hope still clinging to her heart, the reality awaiting her, they would become the moment her life diverged into before and after. In the emergency room, doctors fought relentlessly to restart Emily's heart, to restore oxygen, to save even one more minute of her future. But the wound was catastrophic, and at 3:56 p.m., surrounded by medical staff who had tried everything, Emily Grace Jones was pronounced dead, a sentence so final, so cruel, so senseless that everyone present felt its weight in their bones. The police, who had already detained the attacker thanks to Tony's bravery, now faced a different kind of investigation, not one driven by mystery or motive, but by understanding how a seemingly ordinary day had turned into a nightmare, how a woman with a documented history of psychiatric instability had wandered freely into a public park with knives in her backpack and no supervision, no intervention, no one monitoring the medication she had stopped taking weeks earlier. In the hours after Emily's death, as detectives pieced together the timeline with clinical precision, and her parents tried to comprehend the incomprehensible, the world around the attacker, Altiona Scana, came into sharper, more unsettling focus, revealing a long, tangled history of untreated paranoia, deteriorating mental health, and systemic gaps that allowed a deeply unstable individual to walk freely into a public space with a weapon and an unspoken intention to kill. What investigators learned was that Scana had been in the United Kingdom for several years as an asylum seeker, struggling with severe paranoid schizophrenia, the kind of condition that doesn't whisper but roars through a person's mind, until delusions feel like truth and reality becomes fragmented beyond recognition. Her medical history read like a warning siren. In 2015, she had attacked her own mother. In 2017, she had been involuntarily hospitalized after brandishing a knife due to delusions. She had cycles of stability followed by rapid deterioration, each episode punctuated by psychosis and violent paranoia. Yet instead of structured, supervised treatment, she was eventually placed on oral medication tablets she could choose not to take. Tablets she later admitted she had stopped taking because she felt better, a decision common among patients with severe mental illness, but catastrophic when left unchecked. What makes this even more tragic is that professionals had expressed concern about switching her from injectable medication to tablets, warning that she was unlikely to comply consistently, but those concerns were ignored. And by late 2019, she had slipped into isolation, missing appointments, avoiding psychiatric visits, and ultimately becoming invisible to the very system meant to monitor her. When investigators searched her flat after the attack, they found nearly a month's worth of untouched medication still in its packaging, a silent, damning confirmation that she had been living without treatment long enough for her delusions to harden into dangerous conviction. People often imagine mental health failures as small administrative errors or one-off miscommunications. But this case revealed something far more disturbing: systemic blindness, fragmented communication, and an overburdened network that allowed a high-risk patient to deteriorate unnoticed, unchallenged, and unrestricted. And on the morning of the attack, Scana walked into a local shop and purchased craft knives with a calmness that still unsettles investigators, later telling psychiatric staff she bought them to kill someone, a chilling level of premeditation that sits in direct conflict with the argument that the tragedy was unpredictable. The shock isn't just that Scana had violent thoughts, it's that multiple agencies had been aware of her delusions, aware of her risks, aware of her history, and yet none of them were actively supervising her at the moment she needed oversight the most. A failure of care that didn't just break the system, It exposed its cracks in the most devastating way imaginable. As detectives and psychiatric evaluators peeled back the layers of Scana's recent behavior, they discovered a timeline that was not only alarming but tragically predictable. A series of escalating warning signs that seemed to build toward something catastrophic long before Emily ever stepped into Queen's Park. For months, Scana had been withdrawing from society, spending long hours alone in her flat, avoiding nearly all face-to-face contact with mental health professionals, and drifting deeper into a paranoid world where she believed people were following her, injecting her, whispering threats, and conspiring to harm her, even though none of these things were real. Her fear of them was, and that fear went untreated, unchallenged, and unmonitored. Despite her deteriorating condition, no one from her care team performed a home visit. No one checked whether she was taking medication, and no one ensured she had the supervision high-risk patient required. Instead, she moved silently through the cracks of a fragmented system until her delusions hardened into a violent certainty. On the day of the attack, witnesses later recalled seeing her sitting stiffly on a park bench for more than 30 minutes. Hood up, posture rigid, staring into the distance with an unsettling absence of focus. The kind of behavior that makes you uneasy without understanding why. One woman even remembered avoiding eye contact because Scana's energy felt so tense and unpredictable. After her arrest, Scana began rambling about people injecting her with chemicals, about conspiracies, about unseen enemies, offering glimpses into a mind in freefall, a mind that had been abandoned by the very structures designed to protect both her and the public. In court, prosecutors and mental health experts debated the balance between her illness and her responsibility, trying to determine whether her condition rendered her incapable of understanding her actions or whether the act held a degree of planning. Because buying knives that morning, choosing a crowded public park, sitting in wait, and striking without hesitation all suggested at least partial intention, even within the fog of psychosis. The system's failure loomed heavily over the case. How could someone with a history like hers be left effectively unsupervised? How could her medication lapse go unnoticed? How could months of missed appointments not trigger an emergency review? These questions were not abstract. They were tangible, agonizing, and pointed directly at the holes in the mental health network that had far-reaching consequences. And as the courtroom examined these failures, Emily's parents sat through every revelation, forced to confront not only the brutality of the act itself, but the realization that their daughter's death was not an isolated incident of madness. It was the result of an entire chain of oversights, a chain that could have been broken at a dozen different points if even one system had functioned as it should have. As the trial unfolded, the question hanging over the courtroom was not whether Scana had killed Emily. Her guilt was undeniable, confirmed by witnesses, CCTV, and her own admissions, but whether she would be held fully accountable under the law or shielded by the argument of diminished responsibility. A distinction that carried enormous weight for a grieving family forced to relive every unbearable detail through testimony, statements, and forensic evidence. Prosecutors initially pursued a murder charge, pointing to the chilling facts. Scana had purchased the craft knives earlier that day with a stated intention to kill someone. She had chosen a crowded public park. She sat waiting on a bench for over half an hour, and when Emily wheeled past her on a scooter, she rose without hesitation and carried out the attack with swift, deliberate force. But the defense leaned heavily on her long-standing paranoid schizophrenia, insisting she had been in the throes of a psychotic episode, disconnected from reality, unable to understand her actions fully, and arguing that the system itself had failed her by allowing her to deteriorate without oversight. And although there were clear signs of planning, the prosecution eventually, reluctantly, accepted a plea of manslaughter by diminished responsibility, a decision that felt like a second blow to Emily's parents, who believed the act was far too purposeful to be anything other than murder. In the courtroom, Mark Jones sat listening as psychiatrists described Skana's delusions. Her missed medication, her isolation, her unmonitored decline. And while he understood the complexity of mental illness, he also felt the pressurized injustice of hearing his daughter's killer framed as a victim of systemic failure rather than the perpetrator of an unprovoked, brutal act, a tension that tore at him every time he imagined Emily's final moments. When the judge delivered the sentence, life imprisonment with a minimum term of 10 years and 8 months, Mark and Sarah felt the floor drop beneath them. How could a life so bright, so precious, so irreplaceable be measured against a sentence that didn't even guarantee the attacker would remain confined for life? How could a woman who intentionally purchased weapons and struck a child without hesitation ever be considered safe to release? The courtroom was thick with emotion, with empathy for Emily, outrage at the system, and a somber acknowledgement that no verdict could ever restore what was lost. And through it all, Skana sat mostly silent, exhibiting flashes of lucidity and moments of disconnection, her demeanor oscillating between confusion and composure, a reminder of the complicated intersection between mental illness and accountability, a space where legal clarity often falters, leaving families with answers that never feel like justice. In the months that followed the sentencing, as public outrage spread and discussions about mental health reform intensified, Emily's parents found themselves navigating the agonizing space between grief and purpose, a space where every memory hurts, but every truth demands to be spoken. Because their daughter had not just been taken from them, she had been failed by structures that should have protected her. And the weight of that failure became a burden they refused to let rest silently. Mark, in particular, became a steadfast voice for accountability, revealing details that stunned the public and exposed how deeply the system had collapsed long before Emily stepped into Queen's Park that afternoon. He spoke about the medication decision, the disastrous shift from supervised injections to unsupervised tablets, a change that her own care coordinator had warned against but was overruled, and the revelation that nearly a month's supply of her tablets had been found untouched in her flat, crystallized for the nation. What Emily's family already knew, this was not a sudden, unpredictable act of madness, but a foreseeable consequence of neglected oversight. Worse still, the pandemic-era reduction in face-to-face mental health check-ins meant that for months, no one monitored Skana's condition. No one verified her medication adherence. No one assessed the escalation of her paranoia. And no one intervened when she stopped attending appointments. Instead, the system effectively stepped back at the exact moment she needed structured, consistent supervision, creating the perfect storm of untreated illness and public vulnerability. The internal review by the NHS Foundation Trust, released months after the attack, concluded that Emily's death could not have been predicted, a statement that Mark firmly rejected as not only untrue but deeply hurtful. Because prediction is not the heart of the issue, prevention is. And preventing tragedies requires vigilance, communication, and accountability. 3 things that tragically evaporated in this case. As more information surfaced, the public learned that Skana had shown violent behavior in previous episodes, had assaulted her mother, and had been detained under mental health laws multiple times. Yet her progression was never fully tracked, and her risk assessments were inconsistently documented. And for a family that lost everything in a matter of seconds, the idea that so many professionals had opportunities to intervene, but didn't, was a wound almost as deep as the attack itself. Emily's mother, Sarah, spoke with quiet courage about the daughter she lost, the child who loved reading, who adored animals, who wrote her little stories and danced in the kitchen, and every word she shared became a reminder that behind the headlines was a real little girl whose final, Moments were spent running toward her mother with pure joy, unaware that fate, failure, and untreated psychosis had converged in the worst possible way. As Emily's story spread beyond Bolton and into the national conversation, the tragedy became more than a heartbreaking crime. It became a mirror held up to a mental health system stretched thin, tangled in bureaucracy, and too fragmented to protect either the public or the vulnerable people trapped inside it. And with each passing week, more of the public began asking the same painful question that kept Emily's parents awake at night. How many warning signs does it take before someone acts? When Mark and Sarah spoke to the media, they weren't driven by anger alone. They were driven by clarity, by the absolute certainty that the system surrounding Scanna had been built on cracks. And those cracks had widened into a chasm large enough for their daughter to fall through. They talked about how no one checked whether Scanna was attending appointments. No one followed up when she stopped taking her medication. No one performed a home visit after months of silence. And no one flagged the shift from injections to tablets as dangerous, despite explicit internal objections. Public outrage grew after it emerged that Scanna had told psychiatric teams just hours after the attack that she had purchased knives earlier that day to kill someone, a statement that didn't align with the idea of total unpredictability, but instead pointed to a level of intention that made the system's lack of intervention even more devastating. As the public learned more about the failings, miscommunication between psychiatric units, missed warnings, incomplete risk assessments, and lapses in monitoring, Emily's name became a symbol not only of innocence lost, but of the collective responsibility society holds for ensuring that known high-risk patients are properly supervised, supported, and prevented from harming others. Vigils began to appear in Queen's Park, dozens of families gathering with candles, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes expressing grief and solidarity. Some brought drawings from their own children, others brought flowers, and many simply stood in silence because there are no words big enough to hold a tragedy like this. Through it all, Emily's parents showed a resilience that astonished those who met them. Mark speaking with a controlled intensity born of heartbreak, Sarah with a soft but unbreakable resolve. Both determined that their daughter's death would mean something beyond sorrow. They vowed that Emily would not be remembered for the violence she suffered, but for the light she brought into the world. And they pushed for tighter regulations, more consistent monitoring, mandatory reviews of medication protocols, and better communication between mental health teams. Changes they hoped would close the gaps that had cost their daughter her life.
In the end, when we step back from the headlines, the court transcripts, the psychiatric reports, and the public outrage, what remains at the heart of this story is a little girl who entered a park on a sunny spring afternoon, full of joy, full of trust, full of life, and never made it home. And the unbearable truth is that Emily Grace Jones didn't die because the world is inherently dangerous. She died because a series of preventable failures aligned at the worst possible moment. A high-risk patient left unsupervised, a medication regime changed without adequate safeguards, missed appointments ignored, warning signs overlooked, and a system too fragmented to recognize that its silence was creating the perfect conditions for tragedy. For Mark and Sarah, the grief is a living thing, something they carry every day, something that reshapes their world every time they see a child Emily's age, every time they pass the park where their lives changed forever, every time they hear the echoes of what if and if only that haunt every parent who has lost a child to circumstances that should never have been allowed to unfold. And yet, within that grief, they found purpose, demanding answers, demanding reform, demanding that no other family should ever endure what they did, simply because gaps in care were treated as acceptable risks instead of urgent red flags. Emily's legacy is not defined by the cruelty she suffered, but by the love she inspired, by the courage of the strangers who tried to save her, by the voices that rose in her name calling for systemic change, and by the determination of her parents to ensure that her story fuels something larger than sorrow, an insistence that mental health care must be accountable, structured, and vigilant, and that the safety of the public and the well-being of patients are intertwined responsibilities that can never again be overlooked. And while no reform, no sentence, no policy shift can ever bring Emily back, the world she left behind has been shaken awake, reminded that protecting the innocent requires more than hope. It requires action, oversight, compassion, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. So as we close this chapter, Emily's story becomes a reminder etched into our collective memory. Every warning sign matters. Every lapse in care matters. Every life matters. And when systems fail to act, tragedies do not just happen. They are allowed to happen. And that is something we must never accept again. Emily's story teaches us that safety isn't created by chance. It is created by vigilant systems, informed decisions, and the collective courage to act before warning signs turn into irreversible tragedy.